Spoilers. You die in the end. What remains of Edith Finch confronts you with this fact in the structure of the game. You play through each Finch family member in their final moments, already knowing how it's going to end. And so, developer Giant Sparrow proposes the following. If life is meaningful despite the inevitability of death, then even the fleeting moments leading up to a person's death can contain meaning and even beauty. The Finch home bears the weight of this inevitable tragedy. It's this precarious, impossible structure of scaffolding and sorrow that builds ever upwards, and it's the first thing you see when the story begins. You play as Edith Jr., and as you explore the surviving traces of her departed family within, each spiraling step seems to bring it closer to collapse. This house is the essential symbol in the game. Its shape mirrors that of the family tree, and, like the family, it sits in a fragile stasis. In contrast, the natural surroundings are impenetrable and immense. Behind the house is the ocean that consumed the father and original home of Edith Sr., a constant reminder of the so-called Finch curse, which according to legend is the cause of each tragedy that befalls the family. This curse symbolizes the past and future that the Finch family can't escape, the curse of life and its inevitable end. Edith Jr.'s journey is to navigate her family's tragic past and carry those memories towards the unknowable future. In other words, towards acceptance. She jots it all down on this journal for her son. The major conflict comes about through the different ways the family has chosen to deal with these tragedies. It all starts with Edith Jr.'s great-grandmother, Edith Sr., aka Edie. Edie wallows in death to the point of obsession. She built the graveyard first, along with a statue of her father Odin. The monument depicts Odin looking towards the ocean he drowned in and towards the old house that sank with him. Then there's Edie and her husband Sven with their baby Molly in hand, looking back towards Odin. This image alone spells out the structure of the game. It's an interlocking chain of tragedy that can be traced throughout the family, where each memory and loss informs the mentality of the remaining members. After experiencing a given memory, objects throughout the game come to recall those events and associated characters. In a sense, Edith Jr. continues what Edith Sr. cannot by returning home and carrying on those memories of her nearly forgotten family. Edith Sr. can only look back towards a lost history that can never be passed on, a history the player will never experience and memories that neither Edith Jr. nor her son will ever explore. It's no coincidence that the sealed memories of Orcas Island are locked behind a copy of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, found in Walter's room, which is itself painted like the ocean, sunken house and all. In response to that buried past, Edie builds each character a shrine after they pass on, in a desperate attempt to immortalize whatever Finch memory she can. The game characterizes this further with Odin's shrine. The first thing to notice is that it's the only shrine without a painting by Edie. Unlike with Edie's paintings or even Edith Jr.'s drawings, there's less of a personal touch to this old stoic photograph. Other shrines have poems, letters, some personal memorabilia that ties the character to the rest of the family, but everything that tied Odin to the world is at the bottom of the ocean. While the other shrines involve some sort of deeper interactive experience, Odin's shrine is just an old viewmaster, told with the impersonal tone of real news. Compared to the others, it's not memorable. Notably, the Viewmaster didn't even exist during Odin's lifetime, showing how separate it is from his original memory. But let's look at the sequence itself. It starts with misfortune, the curse and the burial of Edie's mom and brother, then the attempt to leave the curse behind, then Odin's death with the sunken house, then Edie's arrival, then Odin's burial, then the new house with Edie and Sven, and finally back to that first slide alluding to the curse. Note how the Viewmaster loops back into itself rather than simply ending on the last slide. Since there's no indication of when you're on the last slide, you naturally end up going back to the start, back to that source of misfortune. So, mechanically and thematically, this sequence mirrors the cyclical nature of life and loss as it loops endlessly. This furthers the sense of that inescapable, unending curse getting passed down through generations.
Whatever's wrong with this family, it goes back a long ways.
In a similar vein, there's Molly's Shrine, which you experience just before Odin's. Through Molly's memory, you can see when the house was just a house, not the dilapidated tower that Edith Jr. grew up in. The graveyard wasn't nearly as large, there were presents under the Christmas tree, there were no shrines, not even of Odin. The family was a lot more normal than it was when Edith Jr. was growing up. But Edie sends Molly to bed without dinner, which ultimately leads to her daughter's death. Even worse, they lock her in her own room, since she's apparently a bit mischievous. Her diary entry begins innocently with these two details on her encroaching death and her mother's negligence. This guilt clearly haunts Edie, and is the catalyst for her obsession with commemorating the dead, and for believing the curse had returned from that same ocean that took Odin. The shrine even has Molly's own drawing of herself in a sunken castle, just like their old house. But unlike Odin, Molly's memory is fun. Her memory is experienced in first person. Her writing and voice acting are charmingly playful even for her last moments. Even though we're witnessing the final delirious moments of a 10-year-old girl, we can still laugh when she considers eating her goldfish, which would be a very cat-like thing to do.
I thought about eating Christopher, but I held back.
So when she actually transforms into a cat, she gives us the first magical surprise of the game.
And suddenly, I was a cat.
From there, Molly takes part in the vicious circle of life. She chases and eats a bird, then she becomes an owl and eats a rabbit, both in a violent and unsettling manner. Just when you think you see a pattern, like you're about to play as a rabbit or something similar, you become a shark, just flopping on land. So instead of following that rote, sepia-toned pattern you see in Odin's Viewmaster, Molly's memory continually subverts your expectations with a much more colorful characterization. Molly's silliness and curiosity comes through, whereas the most we can say about Odin is he was stoic. But once Molly the shark enters the ocean and evolves into a Lovecraftian sea monster, you get to see another parallel. Maybe Molly carries that familial fear of the lurking unknown that took her grandfather, resulting in this feverish hallucination of it eerily approaching her. Yet the memory ends like this.
It needs to be, and we both know I will be delicious.
It's dark, it's her last words, but it's kind of funny. It's silly, it's childlike. Thematically, the sequence portrays the same idea as the Viewmaster on the cycle of life and death, but it portrays the idea as not just terrifying, but transformative, freeing even. Like Molly, it can be fun and surprising, and most importantly, it's all a part of this memory that feels alive. That all calls back to that main theme. There's meaning and beauty in life, despite the inevitability of death, which is why Molly's Shrine comes first. With Molly's death, they force the player to accept this inevitability from the very start, even if the family can't. This sweet little kid will die, this family will die, even the player character will die. Everyone dies, in the end. They certainly don't shy away from the horror of that, the heavy sorrow of loss, how that can build and build until it's unsustainable. But the game maintains that even those moments are still worth living, or in Edith Jr.'s case, reliving.
I don't mind if I only have a year left. Or a month. Or a single week. I'd be happy with one more day. I can already imagine the sun on my face.
Creative director Ian Dallas alludes to this in an interview. He says, "The canonically Finchian moment was putting players into a place where they knew what was about to happen, but there's a joyful inevitability to it. What you're doing in this moment is playful and interesting, and you also have a sense of curiosity to be excited about it, marching happily to your doom." Giant Sparrow expresses that joyful inevitability through the lens of magical realism, and in a way, that's where the deeper conflict arises. Edie wants to immortalize the memory of each family member who dies, emphasizing the fantastical, the curse, the mystery, the Finch family history. Edith Jr.'s mother, Dawn, opposes this by locking those memories away, literally. She emphasizes rationality, something more mundane but more true to reality. This conflict divides the Finch family, not just between Edith and Dawn, but also between her kids and those who have died, or in Milton's case, those who have disappeared. As a child, Edith Jr. is only able to glimpse those stories through the peepholes that Edie drilled through each door. And here I can start to differentiate my interpretation from Joseph Anderson's. In his piece, The Villain of Edith Finch, he argues Edie's obsession with the curse, the shrines, and the Finch stories all end up indirectly killing the remaining family members. In his interpretation, the game is a warning towards her toxic mentality towards death.
The villain of this story is Edith Finch, Sr., great-grandmother Edie. The most important lines of the whole story are spoken near the end when you're walking through the library. Dawn and Edie say this.
Edith has a right to know these stories. My children are dead because of your stories.
Which is an echo of Edith's words earlier as she walked along the water.
But now I'm worried the stories themselves might be the problem. Maybe we believed so much in a family curse, we made it real.
The curse wasn't just a way to accept the death of so many children, it was used as a scapegoat to justify some insanely reckless behavior. And this has trickled down from Edie and Sven to corrupt every generation since then. As Edith herself says,
I don't know if I should even be writing this. Maybe it'd be better if all this just died with me.
My issue with this interpretation is that it wholly sides with Dawn's perspective at the peak of her conflict with Edie, whereas the game's conclusion comes to more of a compromise between the two. If the stories are actually what killed Dawn's children, then why does Dawn give the key to unlocking those stories to her last surviving child? And if, by the end of the game, Edith Jr. still believes that the stories themselves might be the problem, then why does she also pass on said stories to her child? Even that last line Anderson quotes continues with Edith's resolution to pass the stories on anyway.
Maybe it'd be better if all this just died with me. But I thought you should know about your family. And the history you're a part of.
This part of the line ends up being more an echo of Edie's assertion, as Edith is basically telling her son he has a right to know these stories. In that same moment, the words hang over the ocean and the sunken house, reflecting Odin's death, as well as Edie's last memory from the history of the Finches. Dawn and Edith come to realize that these stories do have value, stemming from that main theme of finding beauty and meaning despite the inevitability of death. Edith expresses this theme in the very last lines of the game.
I just want to meet you and tell you all these stories myself. It's a lot to ask, but I don't want you to be sad that I'm gone. I want you to be amazed that any of us ever had a chance to be here at all.
The Finch curse is really just an extended metaphor for this universal inevitability. Incidentally, I've already mentioned all the times that the game even says the word curse. Twice in Odin's Viewmaster, once in Edith's Moment of Doubt. By the end of the game, the curse comes off as just another name for death, which is why neither Edie nor Edith mention the curse in their final words. Supernatural or not, death is this ultimate unknown beyond control or reasoning. Odin couldn't outrun it, Walter can't outlast it, and Dawn can't seal it away. Even if she disproves the curse or refuses to put a date on Milton's tombstone, well, death itself is still there. That's not to say Edie's obsession isn't harmful. More than anyone, she's the Finch who can't let go, the one who makes it real by surrounding them with death and furthering their struggle in acceptance. Because of her, each room becomes a crypt, even if one of them is still living there.
After the funeral, Edie roped off Calvin's half of the room.
So certainly we can't take the memories contained in Edie's shrines at face value, and we can't value the Finch history without acknowledging the folly. As Edith puts it, a history of imagination and stubbornness and madness. But Dawn's approach to these tragedies is harmful too, yet Anderson frames it as a logical protective measure.
Dawn didn't tell any of these stories to Edith, as we know from her comments. This is what I meant earlier when I said Dawn is the most normal out of all of them, likely because she realized the kind of damage that magical thinking about death can cause. She seals the rooms in the house in reaction to losing her boy, when it would make far more sense to take her surviving children and just leave. When she seals the rooms, it isn't to keep something trapped inside. It's to keep her children from getting in and exposing themselves to the stories.
Now, it's one thing to lock the rooms of the previous generations, but consider how cruel it is to prevent Edith Jr. from going inside the rooms of her own siblings after they're gone. In her comments, Edith Jr. even expresses misgivings for how little her mother tells her about their family.
This will be obvious later, but my mom never told me any of these stories. Edie would have, but Mom didn't like bringing up the past. Of all these stories, that's the one I wish most that my mom had told me.
The most telling moment comes right before that line Anderson quotes earlier.
Walter died when I was 6. I can't believe my mom never told me he was down here. I'm sure my mom was trying to protect me. Maybe she was afraid I'd end up like Walter. But if she never told me about an uncle under the house, I can only imagine what else she was hiding. I don't want to make the same mistakes she made. Trying to bury something that's still alive. But now I'm worried the stories themselves might be the problem.
Edith sees her mother's protective intent in hiding these stories, but calls it what it is, a mistake. If Edie's coping mechanism is obsession and mythologizing the dead, then Dawn's approach is to withdraw, to not speak about them at all. Edith Jr. bridges that gap by recontextualizing all those stories within her own. It's through her story that we find the value in all the Finch stories, while also still warning towards mentalities like those of Edie's and Dawn's. We can dive deeper into these harmful mentalities through the fates of Walter and Lewis. Walter fears the unknown, represented by death, the curse, the monster in the tunnel. So in his last memory, he chooses to live in safety underneath the house, repeating the same day, opening the same can of food for decades. But Walter defies this fear in the end. He chooses to live and confront the unknown, and he dies because of it. As his mother, Edie enables his fear by allowing him to live in that way for so long. After all, she obsesses over the curse too, so maybe she thinks his caution is justified. In contrast, Lewis yearns for the unknown. His mind wanders with infinite possibilities. In his memory, you even start by venturing into a dark tunnel, like an old Zelda game where you would actually hope to find monsters. As he works his dead-end job at a fish cannery, he creates entire new worlds to explore in his imagination. Here he has agency. He makes choices, he forges his own path to an uncertain future. What he fears is reality, the other half presented by his mother Dawn and his psychiatrist, where each day is the same. This dose of reality is supposed to help him, but in the end, Lewis chooses to die. Edie and Dawn represent the two sides of magical realism and conflict, with Lewis and Edith caught in the middle. Of course, Anderson's interpretation sides with Dawn and against Edie's stories.
Lewis's death shows the lasting damage that Edie's stories can have. For Lewis, 7 years after the rooms were sealed, he has to live with the loss of his brother, and that his life has become depressing and dull. He's in such a bad place that he understandably has to visit a psychiatrist for help, and Dawn tries to steer him toward normalcy with a very mundane job. Nothing like the castle that Milton had, nothing like the glamorous stories that Edie kept telling and retelling. Is it so unexpected that he began such involved daydreams then? Is it so surprising that he began to yearn for something more fantastical than what he was being subjected to? Something closer to those stories of family members that he was meant to be a part of and equal to? Where's his version of the great-great-grandfather that packed up a whole house to sail it across an ocean, with a constant reminder of it sitting in the water outside the sea every day as he went to work? He made a story for himself instead that got him. No curse, no monster, no accident. Lewis killed himself because of this contrast between how dull his life was to what he must have felt was owed to him.
While I agree that Lewis's imagination becomes a problem under Edie's influence, it's harder to accept Dawn's solution given the result. After all, Lewis kills himself in the very place that Dawn and his psychiatrist thinks will fix him. If his motive is the contrast between his dull life and Edie's stories, then Dawn's solution clearly accentuates that contrast by presenting a reality that was dull and lifeless. Even more, it's a job that seems to commend Lewis for his mindlessness.
I spoke with his boss, but he said Lewis had become a model employee. Methodical, tireless, focused. Like a whole new Lewis.
Dawn's solution is soul-crushing isolation, and the game draws a not-so-subtle parallel between Lewis and the very fish he's made to decapitate, lifeless on a conveyor belt. Like Walter, he repeats the same actions, day in and day out. Thus, Dawn's idea of normalcy is the same canned routine that kept Walter safe and alone, the same life of bare minimum survival that Edie enabled out of fear. What kills Lewis is not just the magic of his imagination, but the dichotomy between his imagination and reality, the seemingly opposed realms of Edie and Dawn. His imagination grows with Edie's stories of the dead, yet there's an absence of any connection to the lived reality enforced by Dawn, so in his sequence he is divided between the two. And that's how he dies. He's literally divided in two. Mind from body. Lewis ends up portraying a corrupted version of that main theme. He sees beauty and meaning in death itself, more so than in life. The issue with Dawn's approach is more obvious when you think about Milton's room. As I've mentioned earlier, the Finch home mirrors a family tree, hence the family name. And so the rooms aren't just rooms, they symbolize the memory of that character. Lewis and Edith Jr. grew up with Milton, so his memory is just a part of their memory. To lock away that history is to lock away a part of who they are. And don't forget that Molly, the first one to die on Orcas Island, died because she was locked in her own room. Like Edith says earlier, Dawn's mistake is trying to bury something that's still alive, and so by sealing the rooms, she's burying that history that they're a part of. Given all that, I don't think it's fantastical or outlandish for Lewis to yearn for that connection, especially when Dawn isn't one to talk about the past. She seems to leave that to the psychiatrist. Now, Milton's own story might throw a lot of people through a loop, because his fate is canonically magical. He paints an entire world and actually steps inside. The world of Giant Sparrow's previous game, The Unfinished Swan. Here you play as his son Monroe, another of Milton's forgotten creations. The game begins in white space like a blank canvas, and you throw globs of paint to find your way. Your goal is to catch the eponymous swan, an unfinished painting come to life, originally painted by Monroe's late mother. You end up reinterpreting and recreating your father's kingdom as you navigate through it. Broadly, you can see how that mirrors Edith Jr.'s role in navigating the Finch house, while retelling the history that Edie left unfinished. Both journeys even begin with the opening of a book, the death of a mother, and end with a parent passing something on to their child. These parallels deepen the sense of connection between the siblings, but even more so with Lewis, whose depression largely stems from Milton's disappearance. In fact, Lewis's imagination seems to draw from Milton's. They are both creative kings in their own world, a world that keeps growing in complexity. They both create a labyrinth, tunnels with bats, monsters of the sea,
And toads. And things that have not names.
kingdoms to rule over, a ship to leave them behind, and even someone to love.
He had created a female version of himself. The king was in love.
In Lewisburg, he heard rumors of a beautiful prince.
Notice the splashes of paint in Lewis's memory. Lewis also dreams of a palace, and like Milton's real-world castle, it's locked. It's blocked by a dead fish, another interruption by the dose of normalcy that's intended to protect him. He can only find his rightful place through his imagination, through that magical door, just like Milton, to have a crown, just like Milton. And they share that symbol, so any image of a crown echoes both characters. Note the line right before Lewis steps through, about being crowned king of a capitalized land of wonder, referencing the Wonderland of Lewis Carroll's series. Obviously, these creators share a name and an interest in transporting to a different world. On Lewis's desk, a game called The Red King's Dream references one of Carroll's characters, a sleeping king who might be dreaming about Alice, and when he wakes up, Alice in the world itself might cease to exist. It mirrors Lewis in how he comes to believe in his dreams more than reality, perhaps thinking he'll truly wake up as the new Lewis when the old one dies. It's also reminiscent of the ending of The Unfinished Swan when you meet King Milton just as he wakes up and tells you about his dream.
Ah, it's you, the boy from my dream. What a strange dream it was. My life's work was being destroyed and all I could do was watch. When the universe ended, I knew that everything I'd made was over. And then, somehow I knew that when I woke up, all my work really would be destroyed. And that's when you showed up.
Again, there's broad thematic parallels between the games. The ruminations on mortality, the impermanence of all things. But more than that, it strengthens the sense of that sibling connection. The Red King's Dream sits next to the Wonderland Turbo, a console with the logo of an unfinished swan. Considering all the video game tropes of Lewis's memory, these details connect his need for escapism to its source, to Milton.
Lewis and I spent a lot of time playing games together, but he was surprisingly bad at them. He died a lot.
Of course, you can sense Edie's influence in these fantastical stories, how that grows Lewis's imagination in a way that's unsustainable. His mind palace resides east of the sun and west of the moon, referencing a classic Nordic myth involving a sleeping prince in a faraway castle. You can find numerous copies of this myth in Edie's library, next to relevant titles such as The Norse Myths, Labyrinths, The King in Yellow. There you also find Edie's notes, outlining her intent in connecting the family history to these myths. You got Odin's name in bold, alongside scribbles on Valhalla. Lewis clearly desires to be a part of this special Finch history which is so entrenched in death. He even wears a jersey with Finch number 9 on the back. In the same vein, Anderson makes the astute observation on Odin's sunken house, how it sits in perfect view from Lewis's room. As he points out, it connects Lewis to Odin's grandiose tale, and so Lewis dreams of sailing to unknown lands. Anderson frames that parallel with Odin's journey as outlandishly impossible, another example of Edie's stories poisoning Lewis's mind. However, there are a couple examples of that actually happening outside of Odin's story. First, there's Dawn's story. She traveled across the ocean to an unknown land, well, India, and found the love of her life. That's actually Lewis's origin story. His father was a genuine hero who died contributing to disaster relief efforts. There's an Indian flag in Lewis's room to show his pride.
He was so proud of being Indian. I think for him, it was a way to be something other than just a Finch.
And so there's Indian architecture in his imagination as he plants his own flag. Clearly, it's not just about this Nordic mythical Finch connection. Lewis also wants to meaningfully connect to his late father Sanjay, just like with Milton. But Dawn won't tell that meaningful story, because like all the other stories, it ends with death. The other story that mirrors Odin's journey is Edith Jr.'s son. The game begins with him as the last Finch sailing across the ocean and ends with him having reached that same shore on Orcus Island. There's even a little flyer off to the side advertising the cannery. Sure, there's no house in tow, but remember that Odin's sunken house represents the lost Finch history. And Edith's son carries that last piece of Finch history in the form of Edith's journal. The history and connection contained in those stories is important, even if Edie's attempt to preserve it all is misguided and harmful. Dawn's approach denies Lewis and Edith that fundamental connection until the end of her life when she gives Edith Jr. the key to return home and unlock those memories. And really, that's not so different from Edie passing on her memory, which she calls the history of the Finches. I think with Lewis's story, there's a temptation for players to try and see past the magical half of the game's imagery. Like, listen to how Anderson frames this last memory of Edie with Dawn's interruption.
With Lewis's death, she has to admit that Milton isn't coming back. She's accepting the death of both of her sons at the same time while knowing she has to protect Edith better than she did Lewis. It's that desperation you can see as she physically fights with her daughter to stop her from finishing even one story that Edie left for her, one more outrageous than any other that came before now. A massive earthquake, visions in the fog, a magical house in the ocean, returning to your childhood home that's full of ghosts, something that Edith herself is doing in this story right now.
This is a bit of a baby with the bathwater situation. The premise of Anderson's interpretation necessitates that everything Edie does is villainous or manipulative. But the language of the game is magical realism, and Edie's story is no more outrageous than the impossible architecture of the house or Milton's canonically magical door. The surreal aspects aren't something to peel off to find the real answer, it's another layer to try and understand. Because in this game, reality isn't all that realistic anyway. I mean, here, we're playing as Edith's son, interpreting his mother's retelling of her great-great-grandmother's story. Giant Sparrow inserts so many layers of unreliable narration that reality can never quite come into focus. Often you can't tell which surreal detail is an embellishment by which character. For instance, in Edie's dreamlike memory, she sees this deer, which almost seems like the same one that shows up years later at the start of Edith's memory. But then it also makes you wonder if it's the same deer that Dawn shot in her memory with her father Sam. The words on the page don't even mention a deer, so does Edie imagine it, or does Edith Jr. imagine what Edie imagined? And if so, is it the imagination of the younger Edith Jr. reading the book, or the older Edith Jr. writing her book? The deer comes off like this interconnective, omnipresent symbol between the generations. It's an enigmatic extension of the nature that surrounds them, that threatens them. A living memory of death. Edie embraces this form of interconnective symbolism. She creates her own symbols and places them on their tombstones. So it shouldn't be surprising that Edie's final memory is more of a metaphorical representation of death, as opposed to the other Finches who actually died within their memories. So let's dive into that metaphor. On the day Edith Jr. is born, Edith Sr. sees a path towards the old house. That sunken piece of history that in life she could never return to. The ocean that consumed her father opens up to greet her. Along the way, she crosses this massive fog alone, this impenetrable, otherworldly plane of existence. She sees a deer that was shot dead in one of the previous memories. This story is not as outrageous as the notes next to her writing desk would suggest. It's not Valhalla, Ran and Aegir, the Nordic gods to greet her. It's just her past, forgotten memories, old memorabilia that mean little to us but everything to her. And those are intertwined in Edie's language as she repeats the word things. First, there's this line.
I started seeing things.
Here, things are visions where reality and time are blurred, and so there's that time-traveling deer.
Things I'd forgotten had ever existed. But when I saw them, they felt like old friends.
Here, things are personified objects. Think of all the stuff on Orcas Island that recall other characters like this totem pole or these cans of fish.
That night, a lot of things came back to me. Or maybe I came back to them.
And here, things are memories. Or maybe it's still objects. Those are still coming back to her in the same moment. But that multitude of meanings is the point. It's intertwining all of these things. The objects are memories and visions. You've experienced a lot of those visions already by going through the shrines. Letters and photos that transported you into different memories of different characters. And right before her memory, well, we've heard this one.
That thing you're afraid of isn't going to end when you leave the house.
Here, the thing is death. The curse of life and its inevitable end. For Edie, death is all these things. Death is returning home, becoming a memory, a part of the obscured history that she saw every day through that graveyard telescope. In this surreal space, she's at death's door. It's something she can't explain, but she tries to pass on to Edith, at least some form of understanding that might, well, like a lot of the Finch lives, it's cut short. Edie says this happened on the day Edith Jr. was born, almost as if the old Edith dies so the new one can live. Life and death intertwined. A bit like King Milton's dream when he attends his own funeral. Then you look in the mirror and you see his son instead. That's kind of how this memory ends when you're pulled back into Edith Jr.'s perspective. Leaving and being left behind, that's part of death too. And that's how it goes for Edith Jr. when she dies during childbirth. One story ends, another story begins.
This is where your story begins. I'm sorry I won't be there to see it.
So what does Edith Jr. leave you with? How does she approach death differently from Dawn and Edie? Well, in contrast to Dawn, she unlocks these tragic memories, passes on the stories. But unlike Edie, she doesn't place that in this mythical context. Instead, it's profoundly personal. Edith offers the context of her own childhood, a perspective that naturally pushes against the mistakes of Dawn and Edie. To the chagrin of a lot of players, Edith doesn't mention the curse or even a cause in her final words. No one and nothing to blame. After all, blame tore her family apart, whether they were blaming the curse, each other, or themselves. I mean, the shrines all started with Edie's guilt over Molly's death. Dawn feels guilt too in the last lines of her poem about her brother Gus.
I wish that I could truly say I thought about you on that day. Out there on the beach alone, just you, the wind, the sea, and foam. But I didn't, until we found you.
At that time, their brother Gregory died years earlier. Their father Sam was remarrying. In these lines, Dawn regrets not thinking of Gus during this, as she calls it, bottled up storm inside his heart, which mirrors the real storm that ends up killing him. Her poem outlines that interlocking chain of tragedy I mentioned before. Sam has a strict militaristic approach to fatherhood. He wants to give his kids the tools to survive, to confront death like he did in the military, to not be afraid like he swore with his brother Calvin after their sister Barbara's death. His older son, Gus, doesn't fall in line, so he hits him.
Our father never hit us kids, at least not very hard, before the day my brother said with teenage disregard that he'd be dead before he'd see a wedding in our yard.
Apparently it's not the first time, but it's at its worst when Gus says something that mirrors Calvin's words before he died.
My brother said he'd die before he ate another mushroom. And he did.
Gus's strict, abusive upbringing leads to a rebelliousness, reflecting his internal turmoil, that storm. Yeah, at the time, Sam had lost a son in Gregory, but Gus lost a brother. The storm ramps up, both inside and out, and how does Sam respond?
The rain came down in buckets then, but no one seemed afraid that nature might destroy the tent our dad had crudely made. The thunder sounded much too close and full of angry power, but all my father said to this was, "Make the music louder."
As he swore with Calvin, he is not afraid. The symbol of Sam's tent calls back to Sam's own death just a few shrines ago. He dies during a camping trip with Dawn, trying to teach her that lesson about survival. Through hunting, they confront death. He thinks they conquered it together, only for death to rear its head. So, in Dawn's poem, Sam's strict and abusive approach is like this crudely made tent. It doesn't really keep anyone safe at all. It hurts them. It creates distance between him and his son Gus. Sam ignores this inner turmoil, the storm, and Gus pays the price. There's a break in structure at the end of the poem. You expect another couplet, but it's just the one line. Alone, as Dawn says. The ending is abrupt as a result, mirroring the abrupt nature of her brother's death. Another life cut short, another sibling to mourn in a room divided by death. Just like Calvin and Sam.
Her dad had been pretty strict, but it wasn't enough to save her brothers. She was just trying to do better. She lost 2 of her brothers, just like I did. I get why she tried so hard to protect us.
Some of Sam's final words to Dawn foreshadows her own approach to protecting her children.
Dad, I...
Just breathe. Turn off your imagination. Focus on your target.
And also in that final moment,
Dad, it's twitching. I think
That's
it's
totally normal, Dawn. Just focus on the camera. Try not to think about—
Dad!
and that's how Dawn approaches death. She tries not to think about it, even when it's right in front of her. Obviously, that's the opposite of what Sam was trying to pass on, but she sees what happens to her father when he confronts death, so she runs from it. Just like Odin running from the curse, which is what Edie is trying to warn her.
The thing you're afraid of isn't going to end when you leave the house.
That's how Dawn approaches the memory itself, since she never shares it with her children. Dawn tries to turn off their imagination, disprove the curse, and push Lewis towards reality. But like with Sam's crew tent, that strict approach doesn't really help them. It ignores the source of that inner turmoil in Lewis, allowing it to grow.
Mom definitely blamed Edie, but I think Lewis blamed himself.
With this line, Edith gets to the heart of Lewis's emotional turmoil more than Dawn and Edie ever could. She acknowledges Lewis's guilt and pain over losing their brother. And Edith being there for Lewis, even if it was just hanging out, probably helped Lewis more than Dawn and Edie's squabble over the stories.
Everyone always told me to stay out of Lewis's room. Except Lewis.
Whether it's Edie roping off Calvin's half of the room or Dawn locking Milton's castle, it just ends up dividing the family, even more in a time of grief. In a way, Edith Jr. reunites the family just by bringing their stories together. And her story is like Edith Sr.'s memory. She's returning home, back to that winding, ramshackle history with rooms like the branches of their family tree. She navigates old memories and becomes one when she gets to her room and writes it all down. A room lit up by the letters of her lampshade, just like the ones adorning Edie's grave. Her last words of guidance even correspond to the last words in Edie's and Dawn's memories. Remember where Edie's memory got cut off.
Things I can't explain, but that I need you to try and—
Edith, what are you doing in here?
Based on context clues, Edie was going to ask Edith to try and understand. At this point, Edie has crossed the metaphorical fog, this line between life and death, and she's trying to explain what she's seeing. All those things. But she's already on the other side, past the torn seam of this book. Edith Jr. will never really understand these things until she crosses that line herself. And that's what Edith tells her son, again with the word things attached.
I'm still not sure what to tell you about all this. If we lived forever, maybe we'd have time to understand things.
Like Edie, she's struggling to explain, but instead she tells her son not to try and understand things. Things as in death, the curse of life. You can't understand. Not in a single lifespan, not in all their lifespans put together. Remember how Dawn's hunting trip ended.
Just focus on the camera. Try not to think about—
Dad!
Where Dawn tries not to think about death, Edith Jr. tells her son this.
But as it is, I think the best we can do is try to open our eyes. And appreciate how strange and brief all of this is.
She tells him to see life for what it is. For Edith, life isn't about understanding death, confronting it, or avoiding it. It's about accepting death, and in the same breath, appreciating life, however much of it you have left. Beauty and meaning, etc. Her words guide you forward through this whole journey towards acceptance. And in the end, all you have of her is her journey, her story, and her words. And that's what remains of Edith Finch.
This is where your story begins. I'm sorry I won't be there to see it. It's a lot to ask, but I don't want you to be sad that I'm gone. I want you to be amazed that any of us ever had a chance to be here at all. Good luck.